The lecture hall erupted in laughter when the professor smirked and said, "Solve this equation, and I'll marry you." She expected silence. Mockery. Another reminder of who belonged where. But the janitor standing quietly at the back picked up the chalk. And what he wrote next would stop time, shatter pride, and change 2 lives forever. Stay until the very end, because this story proves brilliance doesn't ask for permission. And before we begin, like this video and subscribe to Ever Bell's Tales, where hidden truths always find their voice. Professor Eleanor Whitmore had built her reputation on precision. Precision in language, in logic, in thought. Every lecture she delivered was sharpened to a point, honed by decades of academic rigor and an unshakable belief that intelligence was proven, not presumed. The lecture hall that afternoon was filled nearly to capacity, rows of students hunched over notebooks, laptops glowing softly in the dimmed light. Advanced mathematical structures was not a course one took lightly. It was whispered about in hallways, feared during registration, and survived only by those who could endure Eleanor's unforgiving standards. She stood at the front of the room, chalk in hand, the board behind her already dense with symbols. Integrals layered over functions, variables folding into one another like a puzzle daring someone to unravel it. As she spoke, her voice was calm but sharp, cutting cleanly through the air. She didn't slow down for confused faces or raised eyebrows. In her mind, struggle was part of the process. If you couldn't keep up, you didn't belong. Halfway through deriving a particularly complex expression, a student in the 3rd row raised his hand hesitantly. Eleanor paused, irritation flashing briefly across her face. "Yes," she asked. The student stumbled through a question, something about an assumption she'd made 2 steps back. To Eleanor, it was obvious. Trivial. She let out a short, humorless laugh and turned back to the board. "If you're stuck there," she said coolly, "then perhaps this course is above your current level." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room. Then she did something she would later replay in her mind countless times. She gestured at the equation spanning the board, an elegant but brutally difficult construct she'd saved for the end of the lecture. "Honestly," she said, half to herself, half to the room, "if anyone here can solve this cleanly, I'll marry them." The line landed as intended, laughter erupted loud and relieved a release of tension. It was a joke. A cutting one, meant to reinforce the invisible boundary between her and everyone else. Between authority and aspiration. At the very back of the lecture hall, near the door most students ignored, stood a man in a faded blue janitor's uniform. A mop bucket rested beside him, one wheel squeaking faintly whenever he shifted his weight. His name was Daniel Hale. He had been cleaning university buildings for nearly 3 years now, always scheduled during late lectures when rooms were occupied but nearly invisible. He had mastered the art of quiet movement, slipping in and out, wiping boards after classes ended, emptying trash without drawing attention. Most professors barely noticed him. Students never did. That anonymity suited him, or at least he told himself it did. Daniel's eyes were fixed on the board, not casually, intently. The equation Eleanor had just mocked her class with wasn't merely difficult. It was exquisite. A rare blend of abstraction and symmetry. The kind of problem that didn't yield to brute force but rewarded insight. As Eleanor spoke, Daniel felt an old, familiar pull in his chest. Years ago he would have been sitting in one of those seats, chalk dust on his hands, arguing over proofs long into the night. Mathematics had once been his language, his shelter, his identity. But life had intervened. First illness, then debt, then responsibility. Academia had no patience for detours, and slowly, opportunities closed. Cleaning floors paid bills. Listening to lectures fed something quieter, more fragile. When Eleanor made her joke, the laughter rang sharp in Daniel's ears. Not because it was cruel, he had heard worse, but because it drew a line so clearly. "This is where you belong. That is where I belong." He looked again at the board, his mind already tracing pathways, testing substitutions, imagining transformations. His fingers twitched unconsciously. He tried to ignore it. He always did. But then Eleanor turned and noticed him. Perhaps it was the way he hadn't laughed. Perhaps it was because he was looking at the equation instead of the floor. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone cool, dismissive. Several students turned, surprised to see someone standing there at all. Daniel straightened instinctively. "No, Mom," he said politely. Then, after a breath he hadn't planned to take, he added, "I think I can solve it." The room went silent for half a second, just long enough for disbelief to register. Then laughter exploded again, louder this time, edged with disbelief and mockery. A few students shook their heads. Someone whispered, "Is he serious?" Eleanor stared at Daniel as if he'd spoken in another language. Amusement flickered across her face, followed quickly by irritation. "This isn't a joke," she said sharply. "This equation is beyond undergraduate level. Beyond most graduate students." Daniel nodded once. "I know," he said simply. His voice didn't shake. That, more than his words, unsettled her. He wasn't defiant. He wasn't pleading. He was calm. Certain Eleanor's lips curved into a thin smile. Pride stirred, dangerous, reactive. She had spent her life guarding the gates of her discipline. The idea that someone outside her carefully constructed hierarchy might challenge it felt absurd. And insulting. "By all means," she said, extending the chalk toward him with theatrical exaggeration. "Go ahead." Daniel hesitated only a moment before stepping forward. His heart was pounding now, not from fear of humiliation, but from something else entirely. Recognition. The board loomed large. Familiar, like an old friend he hadn't dared approach in years. As he reached for the chalk, he felt every eye in the room on him. The laughter died down, replaced by a restless curiosity. Eleanor crossed her arms, already preparing the words she would use when this ended, as it surely would. In embarrassment, she expected chaos, guesswork, scribbles that betrayed ignorance. What she didn't expect was the stillness that settled over the room as Daniel lifted the chalk and began to write with slow, deliberate confidence. In that moment, before the first symbol was rewritten, before the first assumption was challenged, something invisible shifted. A joke had become a test. A boundary had been crossed. And neither Eleanor nor the students realized yet that the line she had drawn so casually was about to disappear entirely. Daniel stood at the board for a brief moment without writing, the chalk resting lightly between his fingers. The lecture hall felt unnaturally quiet now, as if the room itself were holding its breath. The earlier laughter had drained away, replaced by a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and second-hand embarrassment. Eleanor leaned against the podium, arms crossed, chin lifted, already convinced she was witnessing a harmless farce. In her mind, this would end quickly. An incorrect substitution, a fatal flaw, a reminder of why expertise mattered. Daniel began by rewriting the equation, not changing it, just clarifying it. His handwriting was neat, controlled, almost reverent. He separated terms, aligned symbols, cleaned the visual noise that often hid deeper structure. A few students frowned, then leaned forward. This wasn't random. This was intentional. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Anyone can rewrite an equation, she told herself. This proves nothing. Then Daniel did something unexpected. Instead of attacking the equation head-on, he stepped back and introduced a substitution, one so subtle it almost went unnoticed. He transformed the problem into a different space, reframing it in a way that stripped away unnecessary complexity. Chalk tapped softly as he worked, the sound steady, unhurried. A whisper rippled through the room. "Is he allowed to do that?" someone murmured. Eleanor's breath caught. He was, and she hadn't considered it. Daniel continued, methodically unpacking the structure of the equation. Each line followed naturally from the last, not rushed, not flashy. He paused occasionally, not in hesitation but in thought, testing the logic, ensuring the path was sound before moving forward. His posture was relaxed, shoulders loose, as if this wasn't a performance but a conversation he'd had many times before. Eleanor straightened slowly, her arms dropping to her sides. She moved closer to the board, eyes scanning his steps with growing intensity. She searched for errors, for shortcuts, for anything she could dismiss. There were none. The room felt different now. Students weren't watching a janitor embarrass himself. They were watching mathematics unfold in real time. Someone in the front row quietly closed their laptop. Another began scribbling notes furiously, afraid to miss a single transformation. The equation that had once seemed impenetrable was opening, revealing an elegant inner logic few had ever seen. Daniel wasn't just solving it, he was listening to it. When he reached the midpoint of the solution, Eleanor's heart was pounding. She recognized the technique he was using now, one she herself had struggled with years ago, one that required intuition rather than memorization. He manipulated the variables with confidence, exploiting symmetries, canceling terms in ways that felt almost artistic. This wasn't brute force mathematics. This was mastery. Her mouth went dry. Daniel reached the final steps and slowed even further, as if honoring the moment. He derived the result cleanly, underlined it once and set the chalk down gently on the tray. Then he stepped aside. No flourish, no smile, no expectation of applause. Silence crashed over the lecture hall. It was the kind of silence that followed revelation, the kind that left no room for denial. Eleanor stared at the board, her mind racing through every line, every assumption, every implication. She moved closer, tracing the solution with her eyes, then with her finger, as if touching it would somehow make it less real. It was flawless. More than that, it was beautiful. She felt a sharp twist in her chest, not jealousy, but awe mixed with shame. "Where did you learn this?" she asked finally. Her voice sounded foreign to her own ears, quiet, stripped of authority. Daniel turned to face her. "I studied mathematics," he said simply, "before life got complicated." The student sat frozen, witnessing something rare and unsettling, a professor at a loss for words. Eleanor looked at Daniel, not his uniform, not the mop bucket, but his eyes. They were calm, not arrogant, not triumphant, just steady. "You solved it more cleanly than I would have," she admitted, the words tasting unfamiliar but necessary. A collective intake of breath swept the room. Authority, once absolute, had shifted. Class ended in a daze. Students filed out quietly, whispering in stunned tones. Some glanced back at Daniel with new respect. Others avoided Eleanor's gaze, unsure how to reconcile what they'd seen. She stood alone at the board long after the room emptied, staring at the equation that had undone her assumptions. As Daniel gathered his bucket and turned to leave, Eleanor found her voice again. "Wait," she said. He paused. She hesitated, then spoke more softly. "That offer earlier, it was a joke." Daniel nodded. "I know," he said. Then he met her eyes. "But jokes can reveal more than we intend." The words lingered long after he walked away. Eleanor remained in the lecture hall, surrounded by chalk dust and echoes, realizing that in one afternoon, her certainty had been challenged by the very person she had never thought to see. Professor Eleanor Whitmore did not sleep that night. Long after the campus lights dimmed and the halls fell silent, her mind replayed the afternoon in relentless detail, the chalk moving with quiet confidence, the equation unfolding in ways she had not foreseen, the stillness that followed. She sat at her kitchen table with a notebook open, rewriting the problem again and again, searching for a flaw that would restore the order she had trusted her entire career. There was none. Each time, the solution led her to the same place. Daniel had been right. More than right, he had been brilliant. And she had laughed. By morning, the weight of that realization settled heavily on her shoulders. Eleanor had built her identity on merit, on the belief that intellect rose naturally to the top. Yet she had spent years walking past someone who embodied the very excellence she claimed to protect. When she arrived at the university, she did something she had never done before. She asked for a staff file. Daniel Hale's name stared back at her from the screen, followed by a history that tightened her throat. Former doctoral candidate. Published papers cited more times than she expected. Withdrawn from academia to care for an ailing parent. Financial collapse. No path back. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, stunned by how easily the system she revered had let him disappear. That evening, she found Daniel in the hallway outside the lecture hall, wiping down desks with the same quiet focus she had ignored for years. She stood there for a moment, unsure how to begin. Authority felt strangely hollow now. "Daniel," she said finally. He looked up, surprised, then nodded politely. "Professor?" She winced at the title. "You don't belong here," she said without thinking. His expression didn't change. "I belong where I work," he replied evenly. "And where I'm needed." Eleanor shook her head. "No," she said more firmly now. "You belong where your mind is challenged." Daniel hesitated. Hope, he had learned, could be cruel. "That world doesn't want people like me anymore," he said quietly. Eleanor met his gaze. "Then it's that world that's wrong," she replied. For the first time there was no distance between them, no professor and janitor, no hierarchy. Just two people standing in the aftermath of a truth neither could ignore. She offered to help him reapply for a research position, to advocate for him, to open doors he thought were sealed shut. Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands, roughened by years of labor, then back at her. "I don't want charity," he said. "I want respect." Eleanor nodded. "That," she said, "you already earned." The weeks that followed were unlike anything Eleanor had experienced in her career. Daniel returned to mathematics slowly, cautiously, as if testing whether it would abandon him again. They met in empty classrooms after hours, chalk dust coating their sleeves as they debated proofs and challenged assumptions. Eleanor found herself listening more than lecturing. Daniel questioned ideas she had long accepted, not with arrogance, but with curiosity. Their conversations were intense, alive, and deeply respectful. Somewhere between theorems and failed attempts, the imbalance between them dissolved. Eleanor also changed. In her lectures, she softened, not the content but the delivery. She invited questions instead of punishing them. She spoke openly about failure, about detours, about how brilliance could be hidden in unexpected places. Students noticed. So did colleagues. Some resisted. Others listened. But Eleanor no longer cared about guarding her authority. She had learned that knowledge thrived best when pride stepped aside. Months later, Daniel stood in the same lecture hall where he had once been laughed at. But now he sat among faculty, invited as a guest researcher. Eleanor introduced him without titles, without qualifiers. "This," she said to her class, "is what mastery looks like." Daniel met her eyes briefly, gratitude unspoken but clear. After the lecture, as students crowded around him with questions, Eleanor stepped back, watching with quiet satisfaction. That evening, they walked out of the building together. The campus buzzed with life, unaware of the quiet revolution that had taken place within its walls. Eleanor stopped near the steps. "About what I said that day," she began, a faint smile touching her lips. "The marriage joke." Daniel chuckled softly. "It was never about that," he said. "It was about being seen." Eleanor nodded. "Then let me say this properly," she replied. "I respect you." They stood there for a moment, equals at last. No promises. No grand declarations. Just the shared understanding that something important had shifted, not just for them, but for everyone who would learn from their example. In time, Eleanor would tell her students a story, not about a janitor who solved an equation, but about a reminder she nearly missed. That brilliance does not announce itself. That humility is not the absence of intelligence, but its companion. And that sometimes the most important equations aren't written on a board, but rewritten in the way we choose to see one another. If this story moved you and reminded you never to underestimate anyone, please like this video and subscribe to Everbell's Tales. Your support helps us keep sharing stories where humility meets brilliance, and truth always wins.